Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Justinian and Theodora Part 3, Purple is the Noblest Shroud by Extra History. So last time we learned about the reforms of Justinian and the men who worked under him. Today, I think we're going to be seeing a rather dark time in the early career of Justinian, but before we get into that, I'd appreciate it if you guys would leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon. It is linked down below. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
We stand upon execution grounds in Constantinople. 7 men are lined up to die. One by one, they drop. The first man falls, ropes snap taut, feet tremble. The second man falls, then the third, the fourth, and the fifth.
Jeez.
Then the final 2 drop. There's a deafening crack, a retort that rings throughout the courtyard. Then silence, and then frantic action. 2 men are on the ground, gasping, grabbing their necks. The echoes of the sound, a sound not of bones breaking but of ropes snapping, still bounce from the stone. The guards look about confused. The executioner has yet to even become aware of his error. A group of monks from the nearby monastery of St. Conon, who have been watching from the crowd, surge forward to gather up the men. They can't let such suffering continue. The guards move to stop them, but the crowd bars their way. The monks procure a small boat and row the men across the winter waters of the Bosporus to the Church of St. Lawrence to ask sanctuary of the priests inside. Soon the guards arrive, but the men are already safely within the church. They have sanctuary. The guard commander posts men at all the exits. He'll starve them out. It's not long before a crowd starts to gather. The men who were hanged, and the men who escaped, these were men of the deems, men of the chariot racing factions that played such a huge part in Byzantine life.
Right, we talked about these deems last time. These were, sports fans, essentially. You had the blues and the greens, these 2 different chariot racing teams, and you had their large collection of fans. But they were a lot more than sports fans, in a society where, it was probably pretty difficult to mobilize a lot of people. This was one of the few things that did mobilize a large chunk of the population, and thus it became this sort of political faction, a bit of I think I described it last time as a mafia-type organization. Maybe not that organized, but definitely conducting a lot of targeted violence on behalf of political officials. It was a social organization, so there was a lot to it. These deems played a big role in society and politics far beyond, just attending the chariot races. And here we can see, now, this idea of taking sanctuary in a church is one of those things you hear a lot about, one of those common cultural motifs of the era. I don't know how accurate this actually was. I don't actually know the history of this. I know that churches, of course, were a sanctuary. I imagine it depended on the time and place how much that would stop the town guards or the army or whoever was trying to get into the church. But, it definitely was true that you're supposed to behave yourself in the church to whatever that meant to you, and people could get pretty upset if you disobeyed that.
The deems, the sports clubs that had a hand in everything from running the city fire departments to making major political decisions, had become more and more unruly, more and more lawless over the preceding years. During a riot that had broken out after a chariot race a few weeks earlier, several people were murdered. A little hooliganry could be tolerated, but that was too much. Order had to be maintained in the capital, so 7 of the ringleaders were marked to die for their crimes. But 2 of them didn't die, and they would serve as the tinder that would set Constantinople alight. On January 13th, 532, the emperor...
even today in many places around the world, you have, football or soccer hooliganism, where you often have a lot of violence accompanying big soccer games from fans of different teams. Now, this is on a whole nother level because of the scale of it, and because there was a lot of random violence, but at times it was more than random violence. It was, as I said, targeted political violence, which is sort of why it's more than just, simple hooliganism.
Justinian entered his box in the hippodrome, like he would for any other race. But these races, the races to celebrate the Ides of January, were to be different. The crowd began to shout for clemency, to beg the emperor to forgive the 2 men still holed up in the church. Race after race went by, and they continued to loudly implore the emperor. But the emperor was silent. He'd had too much of the deems controlling his city. law would be restored. But as the last few races were being set up, the crowd's chant changed. They began to chant, "Long live the merciful blues and greens," because, as fortune dictated, of the men hiding in the church, the ones who'd escaped, one was from each of the deems.
Yeah, and you can imagine how this is particularly dangerous. I mean, one of the things that limited the power of the deems is that they were always at each other's throats, right? The two factions were usually opposed to each other. And so if you had one on your side, the other was usually opposed to you. And so this would stop them from overrunning the city. But you have a situation where both deems feel slighted. They feel like they're in this situation together. And, if you're Justinian, if you're the guy in charge, that's bad news, I'll put it that way.
Then, suddenly, someone shouted, "Nika!" Then the crowd, perhaps tens of thousands strong, began to shout it at the emperor. Nika was the cry for victory. It meant conquer, and usually the blues and greens would shout it at one another, taunting each other as their racers won, or encouraging their champions as they sped around the track. But here, now with one voice, the entire stadium screamed it at the emperor.
And like I said in the intro, we're heading into a challenging and dark moment in Justinian's early career. The Nika Revolt, it is often known as.
The deems had always been kept in check by one another. They were never united, and so the emperor could play them against each other when the need was nearest. But here they stood as one, chanting. This must have been a terrifying moment. The emperor's guard hastily led him out of his box and down the specially constructed tunnel that connected his seat in the hippodrome to the palace. The emperor was shaken, but he wasn't going to be cowed by the mob. They'd likely fall back into their rivalries before nightfall. Surely
this will all be over by the end of the day. I'm certain nothing bigger is going to happen because of this, right?
But the mob, now united, flooded out into the streets of Constantinople, burning and looting as they went. They made their way to the palace and set the palace gate ablaze. But the fire spread. First, the Church of Sancta Sophia, the great center of worship for the capital, caught alight and was consumed by the flames. Then the baths, the great baths of Zeuxippus, the baths built by Constantine himself when he founded the city, adorned with treasures assembled from around the world, fell victim to the flame, the ash and tinder of antiquity floating off into the night sky. By dawn, much of the Augustium, the palace quarter, was in cinders. But when the city woke, it wasn't the stunned and subdued city Justinian had hoped for.
Hey, and you wonder why we don't have so many ancient artifacts, pieces of art, texts today. Imagine trying to survive hundreds, if not thousands of years of natural disasters, accidents, riots, revolts. This is why a lot of that ancient stuff is destroyed. If not, because of the far more subtle, water damage to books over time. That's even more pernicious. But these sort of big events, a lot of stuff gets destroyed. But of course, in the moment, most people aren't like, oh man, we gotta preserve these artifacts. They're like, we're mad, mob mentality, let's burn some stuff.
For 5 more days, the riot burned through the city. The palace was under siege, the prison was razed to the ground, and its prisoners loosed. And through all this, fire. Fire spread through every quarter, burnt its way through the wood and timber, leaping from house to house as the riot raged around it. And the riot itself was a servant of the fire, keeping those who would try to stay it, those who were part of the bucket brigades or part of the civic corps, fighting in the streets while the city burned. And then, on Sunday the 18th, as smoke covered Constantinople and nearly a quarter of the largest city in the world lay in smoldering ruin, the crowd again gathered for the games. Justinian, cowed for perhaps the only time in his career, came out and told the crowd he would give their men pardon. But now that wasn't enough.
This is becoming disastrous for Justinian. A big chunk of Constantinople has been destroyed, burnt down. You have these mobs, marching through the streets, fighting, burning, destroying, looting. They've made their demands to Justinian, who has sort of been forced to accept, but now that's not enough. This is like I said, this is relatively early in Justinian's career in the grand scheme. This is a bad way to start. And if your regime isn't super cemented, things escalate quickly, right? When we think about, mass movements, popular action, think to, say, the French Revolution, day by day, things start escalating very quickly. The ball really starts picking up steam, rolling down the hill, and before you know it, you could be getting kicked out of your damn palace. So this is very quickly getting out of hand.
The crowd shouted that they wanted evil officials removed. They shouted for removal of the city prefect, the man who had been responsible for the arrest of their leaders in the first place. This was to be expected. Justinian acquiesced. Then the crowd called out the names of Tribonian, Justinian's legal advisor who had rewritten the law code, and John the Cappadocian, the empire's taxman.
And we learned about both of them last episode. Two of Justinian's most brilliant and effective officials who played a big role in reforming the empire economically and legally, right? These were two sort of... And of course, that work is sort of underway and still happening. We're sort of jumping around in the timeline a little bit, but these are important guys.
Justinian was stunned. These men were corrupt, but their corruption didn't particularly affect the poor citizens of Constantinople. This wasn't the sort of request the mob would make. No, this meant they were being backed by senators, by powerful men, perhaps some of the very same men who took shelter with him in the palace, who stood next to him while the mob howled outside. This spooked Justinian.
I mean, you know, you're the emperor, right? There's always ambitious officials around you looking to take that next step up. Even people who absolutely swear their loyalty to you, you don't know what they're planning behind your back.
He accepted these terms. He offered a full pardon to everyone involved. But even this wasn't enough. Clearly, the crowd had been primed. In their fury, they called for a new emperor. Justinian again retreated to his palace and conferred with his advisors. He began to make plans to take the treasure...
I mean, this is some pretty classic stuff, you know, the power of the mob toppling and declaring new emperors. I mean, you can think of many emperors throughout history, you know, they were crowned by, well, usually it's their men in a military sense, not civilians, but we're talking about a large group of people who hail them as imperator, and through that they go and claim their role as emperor. My point is that oftentimes, usually, a large group, you know, whether organized or not, whether military or civilian, a large mass movement will play a role in declaring these people emperor or toppling them from their position, right? You know, at this point in history, in the Byzantine Empire, it's not like we've got, you know, opinion polling or any semblance of what we might call democracy, right? That's not what we're dealing with, but the population always has an influence. You know, you can't ignore them, especially if you live in the same city as them. Once again, not to reference the French Revolution again, but this was a population rising up, and they literally could not be ignored because they could just march right up to you. So, even though it's not like you have to respect their votes, but you have to respect the amount of people and the amount of force that has been accrued.
And those men loyal to him, and board ships to flee across the Bosporus. Meanwhile, the mob raged through the city. The nephews to Anastasius, the previous emperor, still lived. Why were the people of Constantinople serving as slaves to this upstart emperor born a peasant when they had men of royal blood that they could elevate to the purple? As the riots had spread over the preceding days, most of Anastasius's remaining kin had fled the city, but one aging relative of the old emperor remained, a man named Hypatius. Hypatius never wanted to be emperor.
Yeah.
In fact, he was hiding under his bed when the mob arrived. But they found him and carried him on their shoulders back to the hippodrome to crown him and proclaim him their emperor. But as this was happening...
Hey, look, Hypatius, he knows how dangerous of a situation he's in. You might, you know, I mean, sure, not everyone wants to be emperor, but you say, someone's so resistant to being emperor? Yeah, because he knows it's probably going to end up with him dead, right? He's like, oh man, I'm in a terrible situation here.
Theodora, Empress of Rome, looked at the trembling men around her, counseling her husband to flee, and said...
And this, by the way, is probably Theodora's most famous moment, right? This is what she is best known for, this speech right here.
Whether or not a woman should give an example of courage to men is neither here nor there. At a moment of desperate danger, one must do what one can. I think that flight, even if it brings us to safety, is not in our interest. Every man born to see the light of day must die, but that one who has been emperor should become an exile I cannot bear. May I never be without the purple I wear, nor live to see the day when men do not call me your majesty. If you wish safety, my lord, that is an easy matter. We are rich, and there is the sea, and yonder our ships. But consider whether if you reach safety, you may not desire to exchange that safety for death. As for me, I like the old saying, that the purple is the noblest shroud. There was a silence in the hall, and shame. Then Justinian said, Get me Belisarius, Mundus, and Narses.
Right, and hey, by the way, if Belisarius is getting involved, we talked a bit about him last time, you know the job is going to get done. But yeah, this speech here, like I said, I think this is what Theodora is best known for. And the reference to purple, if you don't know, of course, purple is the color of royalty. For a long time, actually, purple had been associated with royalty and monarchy, and that was still the case in this moment. So she says purple is the noblest shroud. That is what she's saying, and she's basically telling them, we got to go down with the ship. She's like, yeah, we could flee, but it's not worth it. We've reached this height. Remember, we're talking about two people who, Justinian was from a humble background as well. Now, he was sort of brought up and educated by his uncle, in this environment, because his uncle had become emperor. But he was originally from a humble background, and Theodora as well, an actress. So they had risen far to get where they were, and she was basically saying, you know what, we're going to keep what we have, or we are going to die. And I talked a little bit in previous episodes about, characterizations of Justinian and Theodora, and I said that these are both very driven, ambitious people who are willing to do what it takes to achieve their goals, and this is really one of those moments I'm talking about for her. And, I mean, not to spoil anything, but we know Justinian's going to stay on the throne, because he has a long time left in his reign, and we're about to see this is what it takes to achieve that success. And this is a very brutal moment in his reign that, both... I mean, obviously, he's the one who does the act, but Theodora is the one who pushes for them to stay. And I think they were both willing to do what it took, right? And we're about to see that.
While the palace guards had not been enough to quell the riot, as luck would have it, Belisarius, Justinian's greatest general, happened to be in the city waiting to be reassigned, and Mundus, the great Germanic general who had long defended the empire's northern frontier, was also passing through the city on his way to take up Belisarius's old post. Neither of them had their armies with them, but they did have their personal legions. At Justinian's command, they gathered their men. The last man Justinian gathered, Narses, was a deceptively frail man, a thin Armenian eunuch serving in the palace. Justinian trusted Narses. Narses was his master of the treasury, and as a eunuch, Narses could never become emperor, so Justinian could...
Yeah, he was a real cunning fellow, a real sneaky guy.
Ask Narses to do the very thing that had allowed his family to usurp the throne in the first place. Take a big bag of money, slip out of the palace, and bribe those opposing him.
Yeah, I mean, if you remember, Justin was a military official, I believe in charge of the palace guard, and when a succession struggle happened, he took the bribes that were supposed to be given out on behalf of other politicians and gave them out on his behalf, which played a big role in making him emperor. So Justinian was a part of that. So he's taken, a page from the same book and saying, all right, in my time of need, let's hand out some more bribes. You've got the carrot and the stick. And as we're going to see, the stick is directed at the population. They're going to be... Well, you'll see, and the carrot is directed at the powerful people in the city to bring them back in line.
Narses made his way to the hippodrome, unnoticed, quietly following the stair that took him to the box where the leaders of the Blues stood, as the crowd shouted and cheered for Hypatius. Narses reminded them that Justinian favored the Blues, and you know that Hypatius guy's a green, right? Before putting a small statue...
So, as we remember, one of the reasons this whole revolt or riot, whatever you call it, was so dangerous is because the Blues and Greens were united, as they so infrequently were. They were usually at each other's throats. So Justinian going with the classic divide and conquer tactic. You can get the Blues back on your side, then the momentum of this movement will be dampened massively.
Sack of gold in each of their hands. Soon after, members of the Blues started to silently disperse. But the hippodrome was still filled with tens of thousands of Blues and Greens milling about the arena floor. Belisarius planned a commando raid to snatch Hypatius and flee, but he found the way blocked, so the order was given. Belisarius
and here I talked about the carrot, that's the carrot, and here comes the stick.
And his men entered from the east, while Mundus entered from the west. They marched in a line, cutting down all before them. People panicked and fled, clambered over each other, were trampled as they ran, but impassive, the soldiers marched on. By the end of the day, 30,000 people lay dead in the Hippodrome, and Justinian's reign would never be challenged again. Join us next week as we watch Justinian rebuild Constantinople, and Belisarius sets out to recapture the West.
Yes, so that, by the way, is an important moment in the career of Belisarius. This is another one of those moments that builds his trust with Justinian and his reputation. And one of the most brutal moments in his and Justinian's career. I mean, I talked about last time how Belisarius was someone who would actually look out for the people of the Roman Empire. But he was also someone who was deeply loyal to Justinian, despite some yapping later in his career. Not from him, from people around him and Justinian. He was deeply loyal, so he was willing to go through with that. So this really is probably the moment most that feeds into that, ends justify the means character trait of Justinian and Theodora in this case. This shows that, he was really willing to commit to intense brutality, massacring tens of thousands of people in order to keep his position. Now, frankly, the moral equation there isn't great, the moral arithmetic not looking good for Justinian. But, you've got a guy who has been made emperor through his uncle and his efforts, right? Justinian played a big role in helping his uncle rise and govern. So Justinian's been there. He's someone who's risen up from the bottom. So is Theodora. These are people who are, ends justifying the means types. They've got big goals. They're very ambitious. They'll do what needs to be done as far as they're concerned. And so, after, and he was thinking of fleeing, but after, the confidence was shored up by Theodora, it's not incredibly surprising that he would rather massacre tens of thousands of people than, get the heck out of there. I think other emperors would have made a different decision, not necessarily out of, sentimentality or a sense of morality, but out of fear, the not wanting to handle that situation. But that's not who Justinian was, right? That's not who Theodora was. And I think Belisarius was deeply loyal to Justinian, and so was willing to do what he asked of him. So yeah, the Nika revolts or the Nika riots, a really dark, challenging, like I said, moment in Justinian's career, but one that will definitely cement his position. He showed that he wasn't someone to be trifled with. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this one. I certainly did. And if you did, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Now, with all of that out of the way, I hope you guys are having a good day today, and I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.